One and two and 1, 2, 3. Welcome everyone hailing from 9.1.5 and also welcome to all the future travelers from 9.2. Because the purpose of this video is to create a time capsule for the PvE meta of 9.1.5. To take a snapshot, to take a screenshot at this exact moment, 1 week before the release of 9.2, to see how the specs are currently positioned. This way, in a few weeks, once 9.2 comes out and we start seeing the first few raid logs and numbers and data, we can start looking back at this video exactly to see how things are changing. And guess what? We can then look it up even more because by week 5 of the patch we will have 2 legendaries. So of course the meta is going to shift even more in the terms of powers of these specs and classes, not to mention players will progressively get their 2-piece set bonus of the tier set followed by their 4-piece set bonus, so things will continue to change throughout the first few weeks of 9.2. So it's going to be useful, it's going to be handy to have this time capsule for the raid encounters and Mythic Plus so that we can go back to this video and look exactly what was the situation by the end of 9.1.5. This way, in a few weeks, we won't have to guess, we won't have to try to remember. Oh, you know what, I think Affliction was kind of okay in Mythic Plus and doing pretty badly in Raid Encounters. No need, no need. We will have a video remembering us, what the situation was. So, let's start from the bottom of the performance in 9.1.5 in the second tier of this expansion by looking at their current, of course, performance in Raid Encounters, as well as the one from Mythic Plus. What is the average key level that these specs complete, the performance that they have in these keys, and try to see how they would place if we had to put together Mythic Plus and Raid Encounters as some sort of meta for PvE. So the first 4 specs we have to put at the bottom are Destruction, Warlock, Enhancement, Shaman, Frost Death Knight, and Retribution Paladin. The reason for this is quite simple. Red Paladin is amongst the weakest performers in Mythic Plus, so is Frost Death Knight, so is Destruction Warlock, and so is Enhancement Shaman. Quite literally, they are the bottom 4 specs in Mythic Plus. Their power in Raid Encounters is a little bit higher. Red Paladin gets closer to the middle of the pack. You have also Frost Death Knight, which is kind of there, while Destruction and Enhancement are still doing quite badly in Raid Encounters as well. There is some sort of a saving grace for Enhancement thanks to their Wind Fury totem, making them a little bit more valuable than what it would seem thanks to the Wind Fury buff they can give to the rest of the group. But still, overall, purely looking at the data, these are the 4 specs that have performed in PvE combined. Then we move over 1 tier. We go a little bit higher, these specs are not doing as badly. We have Affliction Warlock, we have Feral Druid, Arcane, Mage, Unholy Death Knight, and Survival Hunter. They might be here for different reasons. For example, Affliction Warlock is performing well in Mythic Plus, but not at the higher keys, and in return they are doing quite badly in Raid Encounters. They are in fact the 3rd worst performer right now. Feral is somewhat at the opposite side of the spectrum. They are doing much better in Raid Encounters, while still not being at the top, and doing much worse in Mythic Plus. Arcane is somewhat in the middle in both, so does Unholy, a little bit lower down is the spec, but still better than Frost Death Knight, as well as Survival. Survival is worse in Raid Encounters and they have a much better yield in Mythic Plus. Up to this point, the majority of these specs, with a couple of exceptions, are also not very popular. Besides Destruction and Retribution Paladin, which for the larger player base, they are still quite popular for whatever reason. Most of these specs are also what you would consider niche, what you would consider hipster picks and alternative choices and whatnot. So now we start moving closer to the middle of the pack, closer to normalcy. We start with Marksmanship, Beast Mastery, Assassination, and Arms Warrior. This is where you start seeing some quite clearer strengths. However, this is not quite true for Marksmanship and Beast Mastery, who still have quite disappointing results up to this point. Better in Mythic Plus, specifically for Marksmanship at this point, than it is for Raid Encounters. Raid Encounters Beastmastery is slightly better, but still nothing to be excited about. Meanwhile, for Assassination and Arms is where we start getting much better yields, because Assassination is amongst one of the better performers in Raid Encounters. It is doing quite well. The drawback is, of course, that assassination is also quite bad in Mythic Plus, but purely because of how much more powerful their raid encounter situation is, they come all the way up to this tier. A similar situation, but a little bit more balanced, is for Arms Warrior, because Arms is getting outperformed in Mythic Plus by Fury Warrior quite a bit, but they are still doing not as bad as all of the specs below them. Meanwhile, in raid encounters, Arms is doing much better. It is much higher up than many other specs, so they don't deserve to be in the bottom 2 tiers, although they are still playing second fiddle to Fury up to this point, up to this patch. Higher up than this C tier, we start getting into a situation where specs are now expected to be at the very least middle of the pack, at the very least decent. Or in an opposite situation, they might be another up and down kind of situation where they are one of the better ones for one activity and not really as good in the opposite one. In this tier, we have Fury Warrior, Outlaw Rogue, Shadow Priest, Elemental Shaman, and Demonology Warlock. So, Fury is probably the better one in terms of results out of all this list, because they are doing quite well in both. They're not the best in either, they're not the best in raid encounters, they're not the best in Mythic Plus, they are not the most wanted either, but they are very solid in both. Outlaw is somewhat on a similar scale, although one of their issues is that they are usually overshadowed by their class counterparts. When it comes to Mythic Plus, they are overshadowed by Subtlety. When it comes to raid encounters, they are overshadowed by both Assassination and Subtlety. But still, it shouldn't be a reason to discount their current power in this patch. Perhaps it looks weaker than it actually is, simply because it's not as played, but it is still definitely powerful. Shadow Priest is a little bit more on the up and down spectrum, because they are performing much better in Mythic Plus at the moment than they are in raid encounters. A more balanced side is for Elemental Shaman, who is doing quite average at the very least in both situations, in raid encounters or Mythic Plus. Of course, they shine more in AoE situations, in large AoE packs or boss fights with AoE. Meanwhile, the reason why Demonology is here is because of a mistake. Pretty much I'm giving way too much credit to Demo, so instead, you know, they should be closer to the C to D tier half, so I'm just gonna leave them into the C tier. That is mostly because of their single target power in raid encounters. Their Mythic Plus situation is still poor, to say the least. Now, into the upper tier of this capsule is when we start expecting each of these specs to excel at something. You know, this is where you want to see them doing much better. So, in the upper tier, we have Frost and Fire Mage together with Havoc and Windwalker Monk. So, self-explanatory. Frost Mage at the moment is the better performing spec when it comes to Mythic Plus, as for range specs is concerned. Meanwhile, however, they do have a weaker point in raid encounters, but not as weak to make them drop several tiers. Their power in Mythic Plus is particularly impressive, so they definitely deserve to be here. Next to their class brother, Fire Mage. Fire Mage is somewhat on the opposite side of the spectrum. They are doing much better in raid encounters. They are the second most performing at the moment of the range DPS specs, while in Mythic Plus they are not doing as good as Frost Mage, which doesn't mean they are doing bad. They are still doing quite fine. They are better than actually quite a few of range specs as well in Mythic Plus. It's just that they get overshadowed by Frost Mage and also not chosen instead of Frost Mages. The other two specs, Windwalker and Havoc, are towards the higher side of results, because Havoc is, at the moment, they even surpassed Outlaw, which stayed in the top 3 with the other rogue specs for quite a while. Now it's Havoc being third in line in raid encounters. They are also the most popular melee spec for Mythic Plus. They are still in the upper half of the performance in Mythic Plus, so they have definitely settled themselves in this patch to be an all-around solid spec. Windwalker is also here, because Windwalker is the overall best performing spec for Mythic Plus, only after the ones into the S tier, and in raid encounters they are not weak either. Sure, most of these raid encounters logs are going to pad some AoE damage in some encounters, but it is still not doing as bad. There are still quite enough situations where they can pull their weight. Even when they cannot, they can still get away with the Monk debuff. So overall, this patch has made them quite a solid spec to pick. Lastly, we have the last tier of the DPS with only 2 left. So we have Balanced Druid and Subtlety Rogue. So for these 2 specs, Balanced Druid is the second most represented and the best performing ranged DPS spec in raid encounters. They are also not doing bad at all. They are towards the upper half of Mythic Plus results. This already makes them very valuable, plus they have a very special niche. They have a very powerful CD that they can abuse, which is very, very rare in other specs to be able to replicate, to do as much damage as Balanced Druid can. So it is a very, very effective, it has been a very effective spec in this patch, in this tier rather. So the other one remaining is Subtlety. Subtlety, I believe, I don't have a great memory, I could have gone back and checked, but I believe it has been the best spec as far as DPS is concerned in terms of results of the last few expansions at the very least. Perhaps only the end tail of BFA Fire Mage could hold a candle to this, because Subtlety at the moment is the best performing DPS spec in Mythic Plus and the second best performing DPS spec in raid encounters. They are overall the most complete, the better performing, the most efficient of DPS specs on this list for this patch, for this tier, 9.1, 9.1.5 and Sanctum of Domination, Mythic Plus Season 2 and what have you. So overall they have definitely been the most powerful of the DPS specs. So this was our time capsule for 9.1 and 9.1.5 and the second tier of Shadowlands. This is how specs, when we combine their Mythic Plus and the raiding power, have been looking in this patch. Of course, some of them went up or down throughout the patch based on buffs or nerfs and whatnot. A good example would be Fire Mage, another good example would be Havoc, Demon Hunter, even Arms Warrior has gained more ranks, so to speak, than before, but this is where we are, right before the release of 9.2. This list will come in handy to you, but particularly to me, to remember how things were in 9.1.5. As I will embark myself into trying to look at the meta for 9.2, we will have a nice clear picture of how it was back in the previous patch. There is also a tiny little light we can shine on tanks and healers. Now, gauging the performance of tank and healers in Mythic Plus or raid encounters is of course much harder. How can you gauge how well a tank is doing? Are you gonna count how many times a tank dies to see if it's doing well? Perhaps the damage it's doing? What about in Mythic Plus? The damage of the tanks, which is important in Mythic Plus, that's going to be the main count. What about healers? Are you just going to count the HPS in raids? What about Mythic Plus? So it is much harder to gauge the effectiveness of these two roles compared to the DPS. DPS are much bigger brainlets when it comes to figuring out how well they are doing. Just look at the DPS numbers and you're done. I mean, not really, but you know what I mean. So for tanks and healers, we can consider their popularity, how much they have been used in, for example, high keys, in raid encounters and composition of raids. We can also look at the level of keys they have been completing, the damage they do in Mythic Plus and whatnot. So in general, I would say that in the bottomest of tiers for this patch, I would put Mistweaver, Resto Druid and Protection Warrior. These have been the three standout, weakest and least used specs overall across all activities, so it's a pretty deserving rank. One tier higher, I would put Vengeance and Holy Priest. This is simply because while not being very popular, specifically we should highlight Vengeance, which used to be all the rage in 9.0 in the first patch of the expansion. Now it has dropped a lot of popularity, it has been overtaken by multiple tanks, whereas for Holy Priest they are not the most popular, they are not the most powerful, but they are not as bad in a situation of Mistweaver and Druid, at the very least for this patch. So they don't deserve to be put into the same tier of those two specs. Now we start getting into the little bit more of a balanced situation with Blood Death Knight and Discipline Priest one tier above. While Blood Death Knight is not having a great time in Mythic Plus, in fact Vengeance is still better than Blood in Mythic Plus, but Vengeance has also been dropping ranks unlike Blood in raid encounters. Raid encounters are now populated by a lot of Blood Death Knights, to the point that it is the most popular tank spec together with Brewmaster. So all in all, just from being one of the two main picks for raid encounters, it makes them a decent enough spec in general for this patch. Meanwhile, Discipline Priest still has their cozy, nice, fancy spot in raid encounters due to their toolkit. Mythic Plus is not as great, Still not as bad as the bottom two of the healer specs in this patch, perhaps similar, comparable to Holy Priest, but just their power in raid encounters is enough to warrant an extra tier compared to their brother spec, their sister spec, Holy Priest. Then we start getting into the good stuff which is going to be completely split, because the A tier of this tank and healer compilation is going to be populated by Prot Paladin, Guardian Druid and Brewmaster Monk. The reason why all of these three tank specs get at the same level is simply that none of them is overtaking the other, because you have to consider Mythic Plus and then you have to consider raiding, and these specs sort of continue to trade blows. Paladin has gotten much more popular in Mythic Plus. As a result, however, Guardian is still more popular than Prot Paladin and used more overall in high keys. Meanwhile, in raid encounters, Prot Paladin has surpassed and is ahead of Guardian Druid, but at the same time, Brewmaster is still the undisputed king, together with Blood DK. They are not doing as bad in Mythic Plus, where they are beaten by both Prot Paladin and Guardian Druid, so this entire cycle, this entire triangle of competing for each other's spots makes them very balanced, very even in terms of power level for this patch. Perhaps if we had been a few weeks, if not a few months in the past, this would have changed, certainly. Both Prot Paladin and Guardian Druid have been rising throughout this patch, so perhaps this is their apex, their highest level they have reached in this patch right before 9.2 launches. This tank tie, however, leaves us with the last two specs, which are of course Holy Paladin and Restoration Shaman, which both end up in the S tier. Now, aside the possible nerfs and changes we are gonna see in 9.2, we have to consider the level of this patch, of this tier. So, up to this tier, I would say there is no debate on this, because Holy Paladin and Resto Shaman have been the more popular, the more requested, the more represented, and the more effective specs, not just in Mythic Plus, but in raid encounters as well. Remember a few minutes ago when I said the thing about Subtlety Rogue being perhaps the best DPS spec in recent time based on their power level? This is quite close for these two specs, because very often in previous patches and expansions, when we saw a super popular spec in Mythic Plus, for example Restoration Druid, they also were not the most popular and most powerful spec in raid encounters. Same goes for Resto Shaman. When they were the best in raid encounters, they were still quite terrible in Mythic Plus. Meanwhile, this tier, and perhaps it's worth pointing out to the last tier as well, Resto Shaman and particularly Holy Paladin have been the most powerful. So it definitely is a well-deserved standing at the moment for these two specs. And with the tanks and the healers being done, we now have the Time Capsule of 9.1.5, second tier of Shadowlands done for both the DPS and the tank and healer side of things when it comes to the power level of the specs right before the release of the next patch. So, in the next few weeks, we will wait the developments of the meta, we will wait how players will evolve their specs with the new powers they will receive, whether it is tier sets or double legendary, changes, buffs and nerfs to covenant abilities, legendaries and whatnot. And as that happens, we will be able to track back to this list, to this video and this time capsule to see how things were before these changes all happened, and see if specs have been losing, if they have been gaining compared to the previous patch, and see if overall what they got was a net positive or a net negative. With this being done, I can leave you to the rest of your Tuesday. Congratulations if you are from NA. This is exactly 1 week away from the release of 9.2. If you are in EU, I guess you have to wait 16 more hours for that to happen. It's not a tragedy, though. I wouldn't despair too much. So with this being said, of course, thank you guys for watching the video. By doing so, you're also helping to grow the channel, so thanks again. You can also do more by liking the video as well as commenting down below. It is worth reminding the forgetful that if you have nothing to say in the comments, you can just let one of your pets walk on the keyboard and type whatever they wanted to say, as well as of course you can subscribe to the channel. But just like the last time this suggestion was made, the subscription button for today will be open to house pet owners. And just like the last time, owners of house pets like rats, parrots and snakes need not apply. That's fucking weird. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I have been lied to. The last couple of days I was told it was going to snow. It has not. I want explanations.